Please join me in Gassho. In a real sense, all life is interrelated. All men are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be, and you can never be what you ought to be until I am what I ought to be. This is the interrelated structure of reality. Namamida. I'm going to be doing this. Welcome. Thank you for coming. It's really good to see you on this, not quite frosty morning, but it's pretty chilly out there. I wanted to share this quote with you since tomorrow is Martin Luther King Jr., the holiday when we observe the anniversary of his birth. And I guess I lost the attribution, full attribution here. The first part of this, like any good speaker, he recycles pieces. So it appears in several places. The point up to where it says affects all indirectly, he used that piece in one of his most famous writings, Letter from a Birmingham Jail, written in April of 1963. Dr. King had been arrested on charges of parading without a permit, a very serious crime, I'm sure you'll all agree, for leading a Good Friday demonstration in Birmingham, Alabama. They had decided to hit during the Easter season when people would be shopping, and they wanted actually to disrupt that shopping downtown a bit. A friend had smuggled a local newspaper into the jail that contained an open letter signed by 7 Christian and 1 Jewish clergyman from the area that called for African Americans to reject street demonstrations and to stick to negotiations and the courts for redress of their grievances. Dr. King then wrote a nearly 7,000-word response in the margins of that newspaper, which later were reconstructed. It was then the newspaper was then smuggled back out of the jail by friends, and the essay was published then in newspapers across the country. It became one of the most important and persuasive explanations of Dr. King's philosophy. In it, he argued that after many long years of lawsuits and bad faith negotiations that had resulted in little more than broken promises, Black Americans in the South needed to take direct action to awaken the conscience of their fellow citizens and their leaders. Dr. King later used the contents of this entire quote in a speech he gave at Western Michigan University in December of 1963. So you can see different attributions of where pieces of it came. Together they come across as a very good expression of Buddhist thought and our understanding of society. Just before this quote, in that speech in Michigan comes, and in fact, I think in the letter from Birmingham comes the quote, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere," which adorns the center downtown in our the federal building in our own city. He made an intense study of Mahatma Gandhi's philosophy of nonviolent resistance, and I was familiar with that, but until I had read this quote, I didn't know that he had some, I'm guessing he had some influence from Buddhist thought. But I'm not sure, because this, and I'm curious about, where that influence came from, because these quotes were done, these things came from 1963. And I know that he encountered, in 1965, he started to encounter the Vietnamese Zen monk and anti-war activist Thich Nhat Hanh, and I know many of you are familiar with Thich Nhat Hanh's work. In 1965, he wrote an open letter to Dr. King, and the two later met on at least 2 occasions, and they became friends, and they considered each other friends. In 1967, Dr. King, who had been the 1964 recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize, wrote a letter nominating Thich Nhat Hanh for the Peace Prize. And it, unfortunately, was not awarded to him. In fact, there was no Peace Prize awarded in 1966 or 1967. I don't know if that's because they felt there was not enough peace to award a prize for. But anyway, so if any of you know anything about the influences from Buddhism prior to 1963, I'd love to know about it. 1963 was a time when Vietnamese Buddhist monks began, I don't know if it's called a campaign, but began self-immolating in public to draw attention to the persecution of Buddhists at that time in Vietnam in favoring of Catholics. And also, I assume, as a protest to violence. I feel like there's a lot in Dr. King's thought that I don't really know about, that in the process maybe of making him palatable for a national holiday, a lot of the complexity and depth of his ideas and his social critiques have been, let's say, de-emphasized. And perhaps he's been oversimplified. And so I was just doing a little research for this talk, and I felt like I was exploring a lot of new things. I wasn't old enough in 1963, just 4 that year, to have understood more than that. He emphasized nonviolence when he was active during the turbulent 1960s when I was growing up. But I certainly remember the public shock of his assassination in 1968. I was 9 by then, and I certainly remember that. And I remember the mood of fear and anger and the riots and violence that followed. I think even as a young child in grade school, you recognize when the adults around you are anxious, nervous, scared. So we've been, I think, through some dark times before that in some ways echo our present predicament. So turning briefly to the meaning of our Shotsuki service, the people whose names we read today lived through many such crises, both personal and collective. Many endured, of course, the grave injustices of the World War II internment camps. Some of them endured the ordeal of combat, as well as upheaval of the 1960s, and of course some of them shared with many of us not things like 9/11 and so on. Through all of this, in addition to the demands of their daily living, they provided access to the Buddha Dharma and the temple. And even though some of us didn't know many of the names that were read, we can still acknowledge what they've done for us in maintaining that source of comfort and inspiration, and we can thank them for that. So whether you today came up to personally remember a loved one, or if you simply heard the names, you know that you have benefited from them. Martin Luther King Jr. often referred to a concept of the beloved community. And by this he meant a society where everyone is cared for, a society free of racism, free of hate, prejudice, violence, and poverty. It's a society based on mutual respect, justice, and compassion, sharing and love, where basic needs are met, both physical, social, psychological, and spiritual. So I think it's not too different from the Buddhist ideal. One scholar that I heard, one scholar of civil rights, a man named John A. Powell, who's director of the UC Berkeley Institute of Othering and Belonging, an interesting name, something I didn't know, but down in Berkeley, I guess that's what we might expect and hope for. Someone actually who worked in the law, was a law professor too, described the beloved community in terms coined by Thich Nhat Hanh. He said, the beloved community is created when we recognize our interbeing with one another. I thought that was, for those of you who are familiar with Thich Nhat Hanh's phrase, interbeing, that was, I think, a wonderful shorthand that really, Buddhists can understand of what King was referring to. And I really like this term, the beloved community. It's very warm and personal feeling, even though King was ultimately referring to, I think he hoped for the entire world, not just America, not just the Black community in America. And even though the whole world, let alone the United States right now, seems very, very far from the ideal of a beloved community, I would think maybe we might be able to perhaps achieve it for our temple sangha. A small group all working toward the same source of goals. Creating a community where we can recognize our inner being with one another. Although I think we might add one other element that I didn't hear discussed in anything I saw, which is, from our tradition, a profound sense of gratitude for what we receive from one another, both one another here today and those who came before us. We include them in our beloved community. So if you'll join me in Gassho, I read this quote one more time. In a real sense, all life is interrelated. All men are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be. And you can never be what you ought to be until I am what I ought to be. This is the interrelated structure of reality. Namo Buddha. Namo Buddha. Thank you for your kind attention.